Good morning, this is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. I just want to welcome everyone to our live event. So typically we do the live events on Fridays, but this week because of the 4th of July holiday, we are going to be doing the live event on Wednesday. So we're doing it today. So if you do have questions and comments about any of the topics that we're discussing, please put it in there because we love to promote discussion amongst our followers. Also, if you give us a super chat, we can guarantee you that that one will be read live and we will take some time and really address the concerns in that. So definitely give us a super chat if you want your comment read out live today. Again, my name is Daniel with Cop Watch TV. You can go ahead and follow me on YouTube and other channels at Police Law News. And make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe to Cop Watch TV because sometimes things like this happen where there's a holiday that comes up. And even though we typically do these shows on Fridays, well, you know, today we are doing it on Wednesday. So I just want to make sure that everyone is aware of when some of these changes happen so everyone can participate live. So we're going to go through a couple different stories today that have been in the news in the last week, you know, really the most important breakdown, the most important issues in policing. And the first one that I'm going to go to, it's really in reference to two different videos that Cop Watch TV that we posted in the last week. And one of the videos was a deputy in New Mexico who just got promoted to be a detective with his agency. And while he was on duty, he was essentially arrested by other detectives for inappropriate communication with a minor. So during that, there were a lot of comments on that video, which we definitely looked through, and a lot of the questions came up are police treated differently when they commit crimes or when they do wrong? So that's an interesting question. We did get a lot of comments on that, and I'm going to get to that in a second. One of the other videos that we posted was of a T-Mobile employee who was having inappropriate text messaging, so sexting with a minor, and the raw body cam video we showed had that arrest and that contact with law enforcement as well. And you know, those two videos were pretty much put up because we have two individuals who essentially did very similar crimes. We have a police officer, and this guy was arrested on duty, and then we have an individual who, you know, works in the private sector at T-Mobile. So I would encourage, if you haven't already, to go ahead and watch those videos and compare and contrast how different police officers in different agencies but are treating two different individuals who pretty much committed the same crime. And there are always people who are going to say that police officers are treated differently, police officers are treated better. And, you know, I don't know how interesting that conversation is about whether or not police officers are treated better or not. Because even if no matter where you fall on that, about they are treated better or they aren't, almost everyone believes that police officers shouldn't be treated better or police officers shouldn't be given preferential treatment. So that's something that's a real common ground that most people can agree with. And I think it's interesting to talk about, okay, so how do we get there? What can we do to make sure that police officers are treated as good as anybody else, or more importantly, probably held to a higher standard? So one of the ways I think we can do that is through body cams. So one of the last studies that I saw on this is that 80% of police officers, city, state, and county police officers, have body cameras. They are equipped with some type of body cameras all around the country. And the more body cameras that we have for police officers, the more transparent that police officers are in what they do, and especially when it comes to investigations and arrests and calls for service that involve other officers. So I think that's important to talk about. So definitely put in the chat if you think that police officers are treated better or if they aren't treated better. And if you do have a suggestion for a video that's out there where you think one thing or another, definitely shoot us that in a comment and we can look into it. Whenever situations like this happen and we have these questions, I think it's good to compare recent cases. Now, the cases aren't exactly the same and they're different law enforcement agencies, but you know, kind of the way that I like to compare this to is the Redonda Vaught case. So Redonda Vaught was the nurse who worked over at Vanderbilt. And a couple years ago, while she was working as a nurse, she had a medication error. She experienced a medication error? No, she made an error and she gave an individual the wrong medication. What happened was there was a 75-year-old woman who was going for a PET scan, which that is pretty much like a CAT scan, only it's a full body machine. Usually takes somewhere between 60 minutes to an hour and a half that you're in this thing. Well, this 75-year-old woman, she had a fear of, she was claustrophobic. So she had a fear of tight spaces. So the doctor prescribed her Versed, which is a sedative, in order to take before she goes into this PET scan so that she was a little more calm. Well, Redonda Vaught was the nurse over at Vanderbilt. She had been a nurse for many years, and she was responsible for the patient care of this 75-year-old woman. And she made several different errors, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. So what Redonda Vaught did is she didn't give Versed, she gave, and my wife is a physical therapist, and so she's going to not be happy that I'm going to pronounce this name wrong, but Verconium. It's Vecuronium, Verconium. So she gave Verconium instead of Versed. So Versed is what the woman was supposed to have. It's a sedative. Verconium is a paralytic agent. So there's a couple also differences between that. So there's a machine that the medication comes out. So Redonda Vaught, when she typed in the medication for Versed, the Verconium came up, and there was an error message that essentially alerted her, like, hey, you're pulling this paralytic agent. She overrode that medication error. Then Versed, the medication that was supposed to be given, is in a liquid form. The Verconium is in a powder form. So she mixed it together in the powder form, the wrong medication. Also on the medication, the Verconium, there's a warning label that said, warning, paralytic agent. So she made all those mistakes to give this woman the wrong medication before the PET scan. And then after the woman was in the PET scan, she didn't check on her for 30 minutes. So there were other errors that were made. And of course, there were other institutional issues as well that were going on, such as nurses being overworked and long shifts and COVID. But I just listed 4 pretty big errors that Redonda Vaught made. She was tried, and her nursing license was revoked on the administration side. She was charged, and she was convicted with criminally negligent homicide. And her sentence was 3 years of probation. So she didn't do any jail time. Now, no one says that she did this on purpose. This was clearly an accident. This was negligent. But she was given probation for that. And there was outrage that she was even criminally charged in the first place. So, we are thinking about starting a Nurse Watch TV channel. So if you're interested in that, please let us know that in the chat so we can definitely follow these nurses who are not doing the correct thing. So Nurse Watch TV, it's coming. Also, so what I like to compare the Redonda Vaught case to is the Kim Potter case. I often call and refer to it as that Redonda Vaught is essentially the Kim Potter of nurses. And if you remember what Kim Potter did, so Kim Potter, who was a police officer in a city in Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis. There was a traffic stop. She was a training officer at the time. She had it over 20 years. There was a traffic stop. Dante Wright was the driver. I believe it was for an expired registration. Upon contact with Dante Wright, she found out that he had a warrant. And when trying to take Dante Wright into custody, he fled the scene. He drove away in his car. He crashed. There was a struggle at the door. And Kim Potter, in that moment, tried to use her taser, but there was weapon confusion. She yelled, "Taser, taser, taser," and then accidentally, not on purpose, used her gun, shot Dante Wright one time, and killed him. So Kim Potter and everyone, including I'm going to say that everyone thinks that what Kim Potter did, that she made a mistake. She didn't do this on purpose. The reason I say that is because even the prosecutor, so the person prosecuting her, asking for jail time, acknowledged that this wasn't intentional. This was a mistake. And that video is all over the place. You can watch it. But so Kim Potter made a mistake. Someone died. She was also convicted of whatever the Minnesota equivalent of criminally negligent homicide is, and she was given jail time after her conviction of 2 years. So a lot of people say that, maybe 2 years isn't enough, but if you compare the two cases, so we have a nurse who makes multiple mistakes. Now, maybe it's busy being a nurse, maybe there's a lot of patients, but she made multiple mistakes as compared to what a police officer deals with, not a chaotic environment. Certainly no one was attacking Redonda Vaught and trying to kill her, and her mistakes were over time. So she made multiple mistakes over a pretty significant period of time, and because of her mistakes, someone died, and she was given probation. Kim Potter, who was basically in a dynamic situation where she thought that her life could be in danger. In that situation, she made a mistake and she killed someone, and she was given 2 years of jail. So the whole conversation about are police officers held more accountable or less accountable, I would just point to incidents like that. And I am a huge advocate of body cameras. As I said before, the more body cameras that we have, the less that this is even going to be an issue, because everybody, no matter what side you're on or what you think, everybody wants the same thing: transparency from law enforcement. And for law enforcement, especially when they mess up, to be held accountable. When it comes to law enforcement being accountable, there's a case that just got, an individual was just released. So another case out of Minnesota. This is kind of a Midwest day today. Another case out of Minnesota. So in a couple years ago, in April of 2017, Justine Rzincik in Minneapolis, she was a Australian yoga teacher who was living in Minneapolis. She created a call for service about, she heard noises or someone screaming in the alley. When police officers got there in the alley, she went out to contact the police officers. She knocked on either the door or the window on the driver's side. Mohammed Noor, who was a Minneapolis police officer who was sitting in the front passenger seat, when Miss Rzincik knocked on the window or the door, that startled him. From the seated position, he pulled and drew his gun. He shot across his partner, and he killed her. And he was convicted of second-degree homicide and third-degree assault. He was initially given 12 and a half years. Well, back in October, the judge said that essentially that what he did not meet the depraved mind standard. So essentially, his actions weren't reckless, is what an appeals court judge said, and they threw out his conviction for third-degree murder. So the second-degree assault is all that stood. He was resentenced to that, and he was given 58 months. By that time, he had already served 28 months, and he was actually released earlier this month. So that's a case where, was he held accountable or not? And I think there's a couple different arguments to that. Well, if a higher court said he shouldn't have even have been charged with this, like he never should have been charged or prosecuted, but he was. He was charged, prosecuted, and convicted of a very serious crime, which with a higher judge says that he never should have even have been charged for. So, of course, you can say, well, the judge only said that because he was a police officer. So I think the argument keeps going through, but again, body cameras are one of the ways that we can get around that. So I think it's interesting. Again, if anybody has any super chats or any questions about police officers being held accountable for what they do. And I think it's important to note that no one hates bad cops more than good cops. So good police officers and people who are pro-police and who support law enforcement, they want police officers to be held accountable. Because the only way to get to a situation to where police officers are trusted and they are looked at in the community as people who can help if there's an issue, the only way to get there is for transparency. So when a police officer makes a mistake or messes up, they have to be held accountable. There is no other way to go forward on that. The next case that I want to talk about is Rudy Giuliani. So Rudy Giuliani was in New York last week campaigning with his son, Andrew. And Andrew, the primary was a couple days ago, but Andrew Giuliani was running for governor. He was trying to get the Republican nomination for governor of New York. And so Rudy, of course, was campaigning with his son, Andrew. And while campaigning at a grocery store, I believe it was called ShopRite in Staten Island, Rudy Giuliani was standing there. And there's surveillance video of this. He was standing there, and someone comes up behind him, and what the video shows is that he's tapped on the back. It's like someone came by to say hello. The person then walks around Rudy, and he makes some rude comments to Rudy. He says things like, he calls him a scumbag, and then he says, "You kill women," in reference to the recent Roe versus Wade decision that this guy mistakenly thinks that Rudy Giuliani had something to do with. So he says these things, And the guy who did this, his name is Daniel Gill. He's 39 years old. He's actually an employee there at the ShopRite. So he was arrested. He was arrested for second-degree assault, which is actually a felony in New York. Now, if you watch the video, upon watching the video, because this is surveillance camera, it doesn't look like Rudy was slapped really hard. It looks like he was tapped on the back. So the idea that assault charges were filed to me seemed pretty strange in the first place. But I guess you have to mix it with, well, I'm sorry, if assault and battery charges were filed. It didn't look like it was very hard, like he wasn't hit hard. But Rudy Giuliani is 78 years old, and he said that it felt like a boulder. He had been hit by a boulder. He said that it was a very hard shot. He also said that he had trouble sleeping because of being tapped on the back. Well, the individual, Daniel Gill, was initially charged with a felony, but after he was initially charged, the judge at the arraignment knocked it down to a misdemeanor. So he is still facing misdemeanor charges for this. And upon first watching it, I'm like, how could this possibly be something where an individual could get charged criminally for this? But if we look at what elements of typical battery law is, so it's an unwanted touching that's done in a rude or insolent manner. So he did touch him. We don't have any issue there. He definitely did that. He tapped Rudy on the back. And then he said something rude as he walked around him. He called him a scumbag and said some other derogatory things. So is it an unwanted touching in a rude and insolent manner? If you go down to the letter of the law, it probably is. But if you watch it, it doesn't look like he was tapped very hard at all. My guess is if Daniel Gill tapped him in the exact same way, and then as he walked around the circle, he said, "Hey, Mayor, we really miss you in New York. You really helped out crime in the 90s. So the exact same action, but had he said something friendly, my guess is this would not have been a criminal charge. The mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, who is a former police officer, he said something to the effect of that after he watched the video that he thought it was ridiculous that there were any criminal charges. And Eric Adams said that he wanted to remind Rudy Giuliani that filing a false police report is a crime in New York. Well, since a judge did at least think that there was probable cause for misdemeanor charges in this case, it does seem like there, at least when it comes to the elements, it's probably reasonable that there were criminal charges, but it seems extremely minor. We have another celebrity who was in the news. Especially men in the 90s, remember Stephanie Tanner, Jodie Sweetin from Full House. So she was participating in a protest over the weekend in California, somewhere in LA. And during this protest, the police officers, so police officers, before they do something, they have to have a lawful objective. That is one of the most important things. What's the lawful objective? What are police officers trying to accomplish? If what they're trying to accomplish isn't lawful, then almost anything they do when it comes to use of force is going to be considered not justified, because they shouldn't have been doing anything in the first place. So in this case, the lawful objective is they were trying to prevent the protesters, the crowd, individuals from going on to the 101 highway. So whether you think that's reasonable or not, or you were for or against the protesters, I think that police officers not wanting dozens of people to go on to a very busy highway, that seems like a reasonable lawful objective. So while they were doing this, police officers were kind of up on like a raised area with rocks, and Jodie Sweetin, so Stephanie Tanner from Full House, she climbed up. And as she climbed up, she was trying to get past the police officers, she was pushed down. So if you just watch the video without any context, and that's typically where it starts. That's where the video starts on most sites, is that, it'll start with the police officer, with her just barely getting to the officers and then pushing her down. But it's just important to remember what the full context is that police officers created a line. They told people, and these are police officers in riot gear, that they told people they're not allowed to enter the highway. Multiple times they told them this. They'd let them know that force will be used against them if they try to, and still people tried to enter the highway. So, again, whether or not you agree with the reasons that the protesters had or not, it seems like it is a reasonable, lawful objective to try to keep people off of the highway. Now, LAPD did say that there's going to be an investigation because of use of force, and that's appropriate. So even though we're watching the video, I'm sure that there's body cam from the police officers. Hopefully, Jody Sweeten and any other witnesses will be interviewed. But anytime there's a use of force, which this definitely was, there should be an investigation by the police department to make sure that the use of force by police officers was not only in line with criminal laws, but also with department policies when it comes to use of force. So we will definitely keep everybody updated on that. Also, Ghislaine Maxwell, I'm not going to say her name right, but Jeffrey Epstein, after he didn't kill himself, his girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, was just sentenced to over 20 years in jail yesterday. So that's important to note. We can do a more in-depth story on that later, but that was some breaking news that happened yesterday. Also, there was a really important Miranda case that came out. The case is Vega versus Takao, and this is also a case out of LA. And what happened in this case is it's really interesting. The final result is that it basically said that police officers cannot be sued civilly for violations of Miranda. So we all know what a violation of Miranda is. Essentially, when police officers, police officers have to read someone the Miranda warning when there's two things trigger it. It has to be a custodial interrogation. So you have to be in custody. So that's the first element. Well, how do you know if you're in custody? And what the Supreme Court and what case law has said is if it's reasonable that you aren't free to leave, that's considered in custody. So if you're in handcuffs in the back of a police car and they're driving you to jail, just assume that you're in custody. Okay, and the second has to be the officer has to be interrogating you. So if you have a warrant out for your arrest and the police officers place you in handcuffs and they're driving you to jail and you start yelling and screaming, you didn't read me Miranda, well, they don't have to. They're not asking you any questions. But in order for police to, ask the questions and then more importantly, use that information against you, that's when the Miranda warning has to be read. So essentially what the Supreme Court said on this, and this was a case where the individual was a nursing assistant, and he was accused of sexual assault. And he alleges that the police officers coerced him into making an admission that he had committed sexual assault against patients. But he also says that the police officers didn't read the Miranda warning. Well, the argument from the police officer is, no, we didn't read the Miranda warning, but he agreed to talk to us. Like, he wasn't under arrest at the time, but he agreed to talk to us. He gave us a written statement. So that was the argument from the police officers. And what the Supreme Court said is that you should have read Miranda. So any statements that were made by the individual aren't going to be allowed to be used against him. So it's the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. So that's important to know. But that the police officers cannot be sued personally for that violation. And the reason for that is what the Supreme Court said in the decision is that Miranda itself is not a constitutional right. So Miranda is case law that protects a constitutional right. But because it is in itself not a constitutional right, suing police officers under 1983, which is essentially deprivation of constitutional and civil rights, you can't sue police officers for that because it in itself isn't a constitutional right. It's just case law that protects. However, when it comes to things like, but they definitely reiterated that, the penalty for a Miranda violation is that police officers and prosecutors cannot use that statement against the individual in court or, for probable cause or to get to any kind of conviction. So that is important to know. So we just did a poll. What Full House team are you on? And Olsen twins, Jesse, Uncle Jesse, Stephanie Tanner, and Danny Tanner. So Stephanie Tanner rated in at 25%. I wonder if that would have been higher before this happened. So those are some of the important cases that we wanted to go through today, and I do want to appreciate everyone for joining us here on a Wednesday. As I said, typically we do these on Fridays, but because of the holiday, we are doing it on Wednesday. So I just want to remind everyone, please go ahead and follow me on YouTube and other channels at Police Law News, and make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for Cop Watch TV, because sometimes we are going to do these live events on different times than typical, and I want to make sure that everyone knows exactly where they are. So with that, I want everyone to have a happy and great 4th of July weekend. Thank you.